Hello, I'm Kirsty Young, and you're listening to Desert Island Discs. This edition may be slightly different from what was actually broadcast, but it is the only version we have. It comes from the British Library's radio collection. The recording didn't contain the guests' 8 music choices, so we rebuilt the original show by using discs from the BBC Gramophone Library. Full details can be found on the Castaways page on the Desert Island Discs website. The programme was originally broadcast in 1980, and the presenter was Roy Plumley.
Our castaway this week is the theatre and film director, Lindsay Anderson. How much does music mean in your life?
Well, it means quite a lot, though I was thinking about this, and strangely enough, I don't listen to as much music as I'd like or as I ought. I think I've always enjoyed making music, though I've never really played an instrument, just toyed with the piano. I have sung a bit in various choirs when that was easy, and I like singing.
Have you ever been tempted to tackle a musical play or film?
Well, I once did a play which could be called a play with music. It was a play called The Lily-White Boys, which we did at the court, which was a kind of satirical musical.
Yes.
Early play with, first time I worked with Albert Finney, in fact. And yes, I enjoyed doing that.
Do you enjoy getting the incidental music together and plotting that?
Very much, and I find the music, for instance, in both films and plays, to me is very important and an affair of real calculation, and that's something I enjoy doing.
Do you play records a lot?
A fair amount.
To narrow them all down to a total of 8 isn't generally thought to be easy.
No, it's terribly difficult.
What's the first one you have there?
The first one I thought would be good because it would evoke certain things in my past or in my blood, which is mostly Scottish, although I've never been exactly a Scot. But my father was all Scottish and my mother was half Scottish, and as a result I've never felt entirely English. And I also thought that it would be valuable to have something stirring and emotive to march up and down the beach with, because obviously I would have to work hard at keeping fit, and I can't think of anything better than a bagpipe band. Yes. And Scotland the Brave.
Scotland the Brave, the Gordon Highlanders Military Band and Pipe and Drum Corps. You weren't born in Scotland, of course.
No, I was born in India. My father was in the British Army in India.
Yes, he was, in fact, a Major General.
Well, I think he ended up as being a Major General. I suppose he was a lieutenant when I was born. My parents separated. They were divorced when I was about 10. My stepfather, though, was also a military man from the Royal Engineers. And so that side of life has always been rather strong in my background.
How old were you when you left India?
I was only about 2, but the connection has always been there. I was in India during the war, in the army in Delhi, and I've been back several times. And I think when you've been a member of what we used to call an Anglo-Indian family in those days, somehow India is very present in the family tradition.
So you were in prep school in England, then Cheltenham College. What were you best at school?
Oh, well, I was a classic. Academically, I was rather proud of doing Greek and Latin, and I went up to Oxford. I had a year in Oxford before I went into the army during the war, and I went up actually on classics.
Was your army career interesting?
Not frightfully. I ended up attached to the intelligence, and we were engaged in the deciphering of codes, which sounds very interesting, except that all that is related to mathematics, and I'm quite hopeless at it. I was never quite sure how I got into it, and I can't remember much about it.
How long were you away from Oxford?
Well, I think about 3.5 years.
It's a long time.
It is. When I went back to Oxford, I couldn't face going back to Greek and Latin. I didn't read great. I took the easy way out and read English.
Now, your second record refers to your wartime period.
Yes,
in India.
it refers to India. In Delhi, we were very fortunate. There was a very nice chap, a brother officer on the station in Delhi, a Yorkshireman, George Wood, and he ran a male voice choir. And I've always enjoyed singing and enjoyed being in the choir at school. And one of the pieces that I remember most clearly was a male voice arrangement of Bushes and Briars. And we used to sing this on the radio sometimes, and it evoked, of course, very strongly the English background, the English tradition, and I've always thought a very beautiful piece of music.
Through bushes and through briars, I lead thee to thy way, for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and play. I overheard my own true love, the voice it was so clear. Long time I have been waiting for the coming of sometimes I am uneasy and troubled in my mind. Sometimes I think I'll go to my love and tell him my vow.
An Essex folk song, Bushes and Briars, arranged by Vaughan Williams and sung by the Bacolian Singers of London. Now, did you play a major part in university theatre life?
Not major. I didn't like university theatre very much at Oxford, although I was always tremendously keen on theatre, on acting, and at one time absolutely scandalised my mother by announcing I was going to be an actor. Fortunately, the war intervened. But the theatre life at Oxford after the war became very competitive, and I didn't like that very much. It wasn't so enjoyable. But I was always tremendously keen on theatre and on cinema. I used to go with my grandmother to the cinema.
In one production in Oxford, you were directed by Ken Tynan. What was that?
That's true. I appeared in his production of Hamlet, in which Hamlet was played by Sir Peter Parker, but he wasn't Sir Peter Parker then, or head of British Railways, but he was a fine Hamlet, and I played an antique Horatio, aged up to about 65, and having to speak with a very heavy German accent, which was Ken's idea of the part. It was one of those undergraduate productions that revelled in eccentricity.
Yeah.
And
This was the quarto, Hamlet.
we used a
wasn't it?
very corrupt text.
Sir Peter talked about that quite recently when
Did
he
he?
was on this programme.
I'm glad he remembers it as well as I do.
Let's have your next record, because I believe that's associated with your theatrical ambitions.
Well, I think that the Tchaikovsky Serenade for Strings, which to me evokes most strongly really the New York City Ballet and Balanchine's Serenade when they came to London in the early 50s, and seems to me an essentially and splendidly theatrical piece of music.
The opening of the Tchaikovsky Serenade for Strings with the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Sir John Barbie Raleigh. Now, even more important than your theatre work at the university at that time was your work for the Oxford film magazine Sequence. You were a founder of that, weren't you?
Nearly. The Oxford University Film Society existed when I got back from the war, and they'd actually produced the first issue of a magazine they called Sequence, and I got onto the editorial board, and we somewhat expanded and somewhat transformed it. And with a friend there, Peter Eriksson, and then in London, a school friend, Gavin Lambert, we turned it into a, you might call, national magazine, but one of those magazines that are done in the bedroom, and nobody gets paid anything for writing
Yes.
it.
What was the policy of the magazine?
Well, it was a time of really rediscovering cinema after war had intervened, and there were lots of films you couldn't see and didn't know about. And I think that we were very taken by American cinema as opposed to British cinema, which at that time was, I think, rather overpraised. And one of my great enthusiasms was John Ford, the films of John Ford. And we wrote about Ford, we wrote about the directors we particularly admired. It was a very combative and enthusiastic magazine.
How long did it last?
It didn't last terribly long, I should think about 3 years.
Yes.
The kind of thing would be difficult to do now because everything's become so expensive. But then we did it on our own money, lost a bit of our own money, a bit of money from friends. An amateur but quite influential venture.
By the time it expired, you had already started making documentary films yourself.
I had. I was terribly lucky. I met a marvellous friend, Lois Sutcliffe, as she was then, who was married to the managing director of a firm in Wakefield, and they wanted a film made, and by some divine intervention she decided that I would make it well, though I knew absolutely nothing about filmmaking, and she recommended me to her husband, and they took a chance, and I went up to Wakefield and I made a film, which I directed and wrote and edited and learned, really, what filmmaking was.
Yes, you made industrial films, government films, advertising films. You were feeling your way about
Yes, I
the
was.
medium. You had an award for one?
Yes, two, I think.
Two, I'm so sorry.
Well, I made a film with a friend, Guy Brenton. We made a film about deaf children called Thursday's Children. That was in the early 50s, and that won an Oscar. And then I made a film about Covent Garden Market, and that was made for a movement which some friends, Carol Rice and Tony Richardson, and I founded at the National Film Theatre in the late 50s, and we were really working our way into trying to make feature films, and this was a film about the market at Covent Garden.
And working your way in still further, you made some episodes of the television series Robin Hood.
That was very fortunate. That was my first experience of ever working in a studio,
yes,
and working with some rather distinguished actors, in fact.
So these were days of hope, not frustration.
They were indeed days of hope, when there was a tottering establishment which it was fun to attack.
Now, before we get to the point where you turn your attention to the theatre for some years, let's have record number 4.
Yes, well, this relates to my enthusiasm for cinema and for John Ford, and unfortunately there haven't been any albums of music from Ford pictures. I don't know why.
Soundtrack albums.
Soundtrack albums, they're so lyrical. But there is a recording of She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, one of my favourite films, and this, I think, would evoke a multitude of great experiences to me.
She wears a yellow ribbon, she wears it in the winter and the summer, so they say. If you ask her why the decoration, she'll say it's for my lover who is far, far away. Far away, far away. She'll say it is for my lover who is far, far away. Far away, far away. She wears it for her lover who is far, far away. Hey!
She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, the Kingsway Marching Band and Chorus, conducted by Alan Civil. Now, you didn't turn your attention to the theatre for some years. What was your first production in the professional theatre?
I did a Sunday night production at the Royal Court, where I was invited chiefly by my friend Tony Richardson, and I did a play called The Waiting of Lester Abbs.
This was one of those without decor.
Without decor. It was written by a very good novelist, Kathleen Sully, and we did it for one night, and it initiated me into professional theatre, and from that, I think, about a year later, I got the invitation to do a play called The Long and the Short and the Tall. Mm-hmm. And these were extraordinarily exciting days in the theatre.
Now, you were to stay with the Royal Court on and off for about 20 years.
Well, I suppose I was, now I come to think of it.
Now, The Long and the Short and the Tall, an army play for which you found some young and unknown actors.
Well, they were. In fact, I was asked to do the play with Albert Finney, whom I didn't know, but Albert, after the first day of rehearsals, developed appendicitis, and we looked around to find another actor, and the one we found was Peter O'Toole. And then there was Robert Shaw in it. I mean, I hesitate to mention the names because I'll leave somebody out and get an aggrieved letter. But they were a splendid cast, and of course that was the time when there was a tremendous breakthrough of young actors coming in from the working class, actors who did not lose their original accents as actors before had always been required to do at RADA, and who retained the kind of vitality and personality of their backgrounds. And that was very much a part of the theatre in the late 50s and early 60s, together, of course, with the new writers who were breaking in. It was a tremendously stimulating and lively time.
Billy Liar was another of yours.
Yes,
after that.
I did Billy Liar with Albert about a year or two after The Long and the Short. And that was, of course, written by Willis Hall, who'd written The Long and the Short and the Tall, with Keith Waterhouse, who wrote the book. And that was a commercial play. That's to say, we did that in the West End, not at the Royal Court. But there were a lot of plays around, like Sergeant Musgrave's Dance by John Arden, plays by Christopher Lowe. I really can't remember them offhand, but a tremendous variety of writing.
You had a very rewarding long-term theatre partnership with David Storey. What was the first play of his that you did?
Well, the first venture, of course, that I did with David wasn't a play, it was a film. And that was This Sporting Life,
yes.
The film done from his novel. And after I'd worked in the theatre 3 or 4 years, there was a breakthrough in the cinema, and young directors started getting a chance of making pictures, whereas before, really, it was impossible to break into the feature industry. And there was Tony Richardson, Carol Rice with Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and that was when I got my chance with This Sporting Life. And that did begin an association and a friendship of great value and importance in my life.
You've done about half a dozen plays with
I
him.
think I have. I think the one I've just done is the 7th, actually. Somebody told me.
For some years you had an administrative job at the Royal Court.
I think so, sort of. Well, I tell
Nobody told you, really, for certain.
No, it was more, shall we say, artistic administration.
Yes.
I would never be any good, unfortunately, at administration in the pure sense.
But then, when you left the Royal Court, you had the idea of starting a sort of West End rep company, the same company doing a number of plays. That was a rather difficult project.
It was written about in those terms, but really we were quite practical in our approach. We really did 2 plays in repertory. If it had been possible to go on, we would have, but I don't think it's possible to run an unsubsidised repertory theatre in the West End. We were very fortunate in doing The Seagull and in discovering a new play by Ben Travers, The Bed Before Yesterday, to be successful. And I think we did pretty well, really.
Right, you talked about your first feature film, This Sporting Life. Very anti-heroic film, but a very good one, which got you an award at the Cannes Film Festival. Now, despite your excellent notices, you didn't set up another feature film for quite a long time.
No, I didn't. I waited, really. I've always been open to luck, shall I say. And although I made a film which hasn't been seen very much called The White Bus, it's not a full-length film, about 50 minutes, I went on doing theatre. Then I got a script written by 2 young writers about their school days and worked with that writer, David Sherwin, and we made it into If.
A rather strange film about revolutionary schoolboys who massacre the teachers and parents. An allegory? I mean, what was going on in this film? I felt I wasn't understanding it somehow.
Oh, dear. I think you should perhaps see it again.
Yes, I should.
Yes. I think you might find now that it would be clearer than when you first saw it. I think If was really a very simple, straightforward film which did combine a kind of realism with what I'd call a kind of poetry, if you like. I think that the kind of violence with which the picture ended did make concrete the fantasies of many schoolboys, as many of them have told me. I think that the cinema is most interesting when it's not entirely literal. And although the cinema tends to be mostly naturalistic, I find it most stimulating to work in when you can actually use the possibilities of cinema to transcend the naturalistic or literal.
I didn't see the next film, Oh Lucky Man, a very personal film, I believe.
I think it was. It was an extraordinary venture that I'm proud of. It was a very ambitious film. It went beyond If, I would say, in its ideas, in its philosophy. It was a mixture of a satirical picture of society in a rather Candide-type way with a spiritual quest in terms of humour, satire, and the picaresque. So it's a picture that had an enormous spread to it. The original version is about 2 hours and 50 minutes, and was a very big undertaking. I think there's a line from Browning, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Well, I little bit think of that in relation to Oh Lucky Man.
Right, we've got to record number 5.
Well, that is from Oh Lucky Man. One of the important things about the picture was the musical content, and there was a score on songs written by Alan Price, I think very brilliantly, and I would like to, well, I'd like to have the whole album with me if I may, but perhaps we might hear one which I particularly like, Poor People, which will remind me of that network of associations.
Poor people are poor people, and they don't understand. A man's got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people stay poor people, and they never get to see. Someone's got to win in the human race. If it isn't you, then it has to be me. So smile while you're making it, laugh while you're taking it, even though you're faking it. Nobody's gonna know, nobody's gonna know. No use mumbling, it's no use grumbling. Life just isn't fair. There's no easy days, there's no easy ways. Just get out there and do it, and sing, and they'll sing your song. Laugh while you're getting on. Smile and they'll string along, and nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. And nobody's gonna know.
Alan Price singing Poor People from Oh Lucky Man. You've stayed with directing. You've done very little writing and remarkably little acting, although you have done a bit.
Well, it's nice of you to say that. I don't regard myself as an actor. I think I can perform a little bit. I think I am, for good or ill, a director. I'm not a creative writer. I've done a bit of critical writing, and I'm just finishing a book, actually, which will be published at the end of the year, I think, on John Ford. Mm-hmm. But I don't regard myself as a creative writer.
You've criticised the subsidised theatre fairly heavily in the past. You're now working at the National. Well, obviously it's a pity not to use the facilities, even if you criticise the setup. Another David Story play, a sort of fragment, really.
Well, it's, of course, it's difficult to find the word. It isn't like a 3-act plotted play. A fragment, I don't know, a poem, an elegy, a piece.
Early days with a lovely performance by Sir Ralph Richardson.
Indeed.
And you've recently done your first television production.
Oh, yes.
The Old Crowd by Alan Bennett. Is this something that's going to continue?
Oh, well, that's an embarrassing question. I enjoyed doing the piece very much, and I think we were all, those of us who made it, we liked The Old Crowd. We thought it was terrific, and the degree to which it aroused outrage and venom from the critics really, I think, confirmed us in our feeling that we'd done something rather good. You know, television is such a conformist medium. I think this is the great sadness of it. Of course, the potential of television is very great, but the opportunity to do anything really original on television is extremely small, and it is essentially a medium for conformists.
There's a story about you that at the age of 9 you wrote on a looking glass the words, "I rebel."
No.
About nothing in particular. Is that true?
Well, it was that actually pinned up these words on the notice board at St. Ronan's, my prep school, with a boy called Stead. And Stead and I put this up, and it wasn't apropos anything. It was really very odd. I think I shouldn't have told anybody that story, because one finds it ceaselessly repeated and, so to speak, pinned on one's back.
It would have got around in any case.
It probably would. I think that really, as society gets more conformist, I think one has a duty to be a sceptical individual, true to oneself. Shall I just put it like that? I think to become a professional rebel would be very boring. On the other hand, I do think that safety and conformism is even more boring.
Let's have another record. It's the time we did.
Most of these records I like very much as music, and they are related to my experiences, of course. And one doesn't have to have any reason, of course, for wanting the Brandenburg concertos. But the end of the 6th Brandenburg is one that also happily recalls a David Storey play, Life Class, because we use this at the end of the play, through the curtain call and all through the time when the audience left the theatre. So we played the entire movement, and I think it has great exhilaration and positiveness, and this would do me good.
The last movement of the 6th Brandenburg Concerto, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Sir Adrian Boult. Let's go straight into our next one, number 7.
Well, there couldn't be, I suppose, a greater contrast in the English hymn with which we follow. That's The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended. And that, to me, is such an emotional and nostalgic and charming piece of music that I just know I would like to have it.
The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended, sung by the Leeds Parish Church Choir. Are you a practical man? Could you look after yourself on a desert island? Are you good at building huts and fishing and that sort of thing?
No, I don't think I am, but I think I'm perhaps not as bad as I think I am.
Yes.
I think as a little boy I did a bit of fishing. Oh yes, and recently, but I'm not a fisherman, but I think if driven to it, I could surprise myself.
Would you try to escape?
I don't think I would at first, because there'd be so much I would be happy to get away from, but I might be driven to it by boredom, though I'm not confident that I would pull it off.
Record number 8.
Well, I feel that, particularly with a hymn like The Day Thou Gavest, there might be a danger of my sinking into a somewhat sentimental or over-nostalgic frame of mind, and I would like to have a song by Brecht, who is a writer and theatre director I have enormously admired and probably been to some degree influenced by. And I'd like to have Brecht himself singing the song of human inadequacy from the Threepenny Opera. I think the kind of irony that there is in Brecht, which didn't make him at all a cold kind of man or a cold kind of artist, but which really fueled his humanism and his passion. I think that kind of irony is indispensable, and I think this would prevent me getting too sentimental about the world that I was divorced from.
Der Mensch lebt durch den Kopf, der Kopf reicht ihm nicht aus. Versuch es nur von deinem Kopf, lebt höchstens eine Laus. Denn für dieses Leben ist der Mensch nicht schlau genug. Niemals merkt er eben diesen Lug und Trug. Ja, mach nur einen Plan, sei nur ein großes Licht und mach dann noch einen zweiten Plan, den tun sie beide nicht. Denn für dieses Leben ist der Mensch nicht schlecht genug, doch sein höheres Streben ist ein schöner Zug. Ja, renn nur nach dem Glück, doch renne nicht zu sehr, denn alle rennen nach dem Glück, das Glück rennt hinterher. Denn für dieses Leben ist der Mensch nicht anspruchslos genug, drum ist all sein Streben nur ein Selbstbetrug. Der Mensch ist gar nicht gut, drum hau ihn auf den Hut. Hast du ihn auf den Hut gehaut, dann wird er vielleicht gut. Denn für dieses Leben ist der Mensch nicht gut genug. Darum haut ihn eben ruhig auf den Hut.
Brecht himself singing a song from the Threepenny Opera. If you could take one disc and one disc only, which would it be?
I think I'd be tempted by Brecht because he's so healthily caustic, but I'd probably settle for Bach.
The 6th Brandenburg Concerto.
Yes.
And one luxury?
Well, the luxury is perhaps a bit practical, but I was thinking what I'd like. I think I'd like a box of, if I might have, of seeds with instructions on the back and a watering can.
Yes, we'd have to have notice of what sort of seeds you want. They mustn't be too practical, those seeds.
Can they be mixed?
They can be pretty mixed, yes. I mean, after all, I couldn't tell one seed from another if you showed me the box. I think you can get away with quite a lot there. And one book apart from the Bible and Shakespeare and big encyclopedias.
Well, I thought perhaps of a Loeb edition of Homer, which has the Greek on one side and the English on the other, and it's between that and I would also like to read again very much Les Thibauts by Roger Martin du Gard, which is a book that seems completely to have disappeared, an epic book with almost the kind of scope of a bourgeois war and peace.
Well, I'm afraid you have to make a decision.
Well,
Homer or Thibaut?
I'll take Les Thibauts.
Right. Les Thibauts by Roger Martin du Gard.
Correct.
That shall be your
Yes.
book. And I think, as it's you shall have one film, which we'll rig up for you on a videotape machine.
Yes, one is almost worse than none, but I think it'll have to be Ford, my most constant enthusiasm. And of Ford's pictures, I'll probably settle for what I would think is his most personal, and that's They Were Expendable.
John Ford's They Were Expendable. And thank you, Lindsay Anderson, for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.
Happy to have joined the ranks.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.